Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Before we dig too far deep into our presentation, I first want to say thanks so much for having us. We're excited to partner with Arizona IDA and provide information and support and guidance in our partnership together. So we're super excited to have you here with us. And it is my extreme pleasure to announce our new dyslexia and literacy intervention specialist, Maggie Velazquez, who is here. Yay! And so Maggie, this is her, she just joined us at ADE. This is her first presentation to the world. So we wanted to make sure that she was a part of these trainings. She will be joining me the next few days. We're giving her some time to get her feet wet and get used to different things. And so she'll be my co-host as we present these next few sessions. All right, without further ado, we're going to jump right in. As Rebekah mentioned, that if you have questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. We will get to those as we progress, and we'll just do what we can to make sure we answer everything. All right. So let's go ahead and get started then. Our session today is really specific to legislation, and specifically the Move On When Reading, which is our K-3 and literacy and dyslexia legislation. So we're gonna take a dive today into what that looks like and sounds like. So welcome. All right, here are the key ideas for our time together. We're wanting to summarize that current MOWR legislation that includes those dyslexia components. And then we're also going to notice how that legislation connects with the science of reading. So we're going to make that strong connection as we move through our time together today. All right, the first big question that sometimes people aren't even sure about is, when you see those letters, move on when reading, is that MOWR or is it MOWR? Well, of course, if you know frequency of sounds, then OW comes more often for those two letters than O. So MOWR is how we often say it. So oops, so sorry. My mouse is super touchy today. Sorry about that. There we go. So we say MOWR just because of what comes most often, but we have heard it MOWR as well. All right. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to dig right into reviewing the current laws. So what we're going to do is I want you to go ahead, if you can, open up another browser, and you're going to put in the link. You know what, Rebekah, I don't know if we're able to put in links in the chat for people. We didn't really talk about that. Sorry, everyone. But
if you tell me what the link is.
Sure. It's az.gov/MOWR, MOWR.
Okay, perfect.
So if you, as participants, want to go ahead and jump into that site with us, then we can navigate together. We're going to really dive into the legislation, like I said, so it will be helpful for you to go ahead and do that. So, and I cannot see the chat, Rebekah, so I'm not sure when you're ready.
I put it in there for you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. All right, so here we go. What we're going to do then is go ahead and review the current laws. So we're going to see what's in place. In our future sessions, these presentations are going to build over the next 3 times together. And so we're going to talk about the current law, but then by the time we get to our third session, we're going to also have some coverage of legislation in progress. And who knows, it may be signed by the time we get to our last session. So we're going to talk about current laws right now. And then as we're able to in future sessions, get into potential changes. All right, so if you're at the Move On When Reading site, you'll see this landing page. Now, if you haven't already, you might want to go ahead and bookmark this page. It has a lot of our current K-3 literacy information there. Also, this front little space where you see the little Arizona with the bullseye in it, in that space right there above the blue bars is where we put a lot of our updated or recent information. So as there are new things happening, we try to keep that as our like current events kind of page. So do bookmark this page and use it to keep updated on what's going on. Before we even dig into the legislation, I do want you to notice that on the right, that blue bar, you'll see that we have our specialty pages, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later, but will also see that we have our dyslexia specific page listed there as well. So you'll see that in my slide here, I have the 3 components listed, and those 3 components, ARS 15701, 704, and 211, are the, oh, goodness gracious, my mouse is so sensitive, so sorry. Keeping my hand off of it. Those are our early literacy legislation. That's the key legislation that impacts all K-3 reading in the state. So let's go ahead and take a look. So, real quick, if you do click on that first bar, ARS 15-701, that's the one we're going to look at first. And so when you click it open, there should be a little blurb of information, but then there's also a hyperlink to the entirety of the legislation. All right, and so to summarize what the lengthy legislation shares is that 15701 is our promotion retention portion for 3rd grade. So the law does state that a student who doesn't meet the criteria of the state assessment, of passing the state assessment, the reading portion, should be retained at 3rd grade. There are 4 exemptions to this. So if a student is receiving special education services, is kind of in that RTI or the child study process to be there. If the student is an EL learner with a certain criteria. And then there's also one called the bad day clause. So if a student typically has data over time to suggest that they were on track or doing okay, but then the day of the test, they were sick or just didn't do well, then the school and the teacher can use the previous data from their universal screeners or whatever as evidence that the student was on track. Also, 15701 does require the use of a universal screener. We have been able to layer the dyslexia components so that our universal screeners now also have the dyslexia screening component. So our screeners are now called universal literacy and dyslexia screeners. So 701 specifically addresses that and what should be worked on with that. In future sessions, we're going to talk about the universal literacy and dyslexia screeners, how we went through the process of determining them and the current list and what to look for in those. So we'll be in future session. And then also 701 talks about the requirements for notifying parents if there is a concern or issue or something that's identified as a potential area of a struggle. So that is 701. And then we're just going to click. So if you go back to the blue bars, the next bar down is 704. Again, 704, we're going to just kind of look at the big ideas. There's much more in there and worthy of a read, but we're just going to kind of hit the highlights. And for 704, this is our CIA curriculum or CIA legislation. It's curriculum instruction and assessment. So it's all the big things that we talk about in education. So again, this is talking about not only the screening piece, that universal literacy and dyslexia screener, but also talks about diagnostics and how do we dig in to find out more information. You know, the universal screener is, Sarah, our colleague, she says it's like dipping the toothpick into the center of the cake to see if it's done or not. It's a quick check. If it's not done, then you do some other things to figure out, you know, if it's been 4 hours and it's still not done in the middle, then we have a problem maybe with oven, or we have to figure out something. It's not the cake. There's something else going on. And it's not the toothpick, right? The toothpick is just telling us that it's still not done in the middle. Those diagnostics of digging into what skill specific, being careful to note that all of this legislation does not mean that teachers in a classroom capacity are diagnosing dyslexia, but this is more a skill diagnostic of what areas a student may be lacking and that the teacher or support system can intervene in. And then, of course, those classroom-based assessments that teachers use to drive their instruction to make good choices for the students in front of them. The dyslexia screening plan is part of 704, where we, within 45 days, there's a screening done, the parent notification, and then those key indicators are included in there. And we have some guidance. Again, we're going to talk about this kind of in other sessions, but there is some guidance that we have housed on our dyslexia page that goes with a lot of this. So if you're looking for more information, be sure to click around. One caveat to note, which is unfortunate, but one of our pages in our MOWR web page, our whole site, is broken right now, and so some of the drop downs don't actually work. So we are working on it. If you start clicking around, you're like, this one doesn't work. We know it's in the administration tab of the MOWR web page. It's just broken right now, and IT is working on it. So back to 704. Ongoing curriculum review. So if there's a school or a district that does not have data to support that their students are doing well with that curriculum, then there should be a curriculum review. Also, part of this is understanding that nothing is stagnant. We need to keep reviewing to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our students. Also, teacher professional development is included in this. And then essentially a definition of reading. And we're going to talk about this component specifically later in our presentation today, but that explicit systematic instruction in essential components of reading. Now, later in the legislation, we are going to show the slide, we will talk about the exact components of reading as defined by this legislation, and that also shows up in our standards. All right, one more bit of legislation. So the next blue bar is 211. And in 211, this is where we kind of get some names to positions and different things. So our K3 program is identified. Our K3 MOWR is our K3 program. So that gets its name from here. Also our state dyslexia specialist, who is Maggie now, who has joined us. Also in this legislation that was updated in 2019 that requires one teacher on every K3 campus to have training related to dyslexia. So we're naming this person the dyslexia training designee. This person would take some required courses, and we're going to talk about this on another session as well, and be a source for other teachers, for their colleagues on a campus. This person, again, does not diagnose dyslexia, but instead is a intervention has extra training in reading and interventions and understanding and recognizing dyslexia, so they can be a support. And then, of course, with MOWR, there is the requirement that every school, well, most schools, it depends on what their designation is, submits a literacy plan, and it has many components in the literacy plan by October 1st, and then they also must report data 3 times a year. Schools must do that. And then every year, my team and I create the state literacy report, and we get that sent out. So all of those things are work together to show us what 211 is. All right. So in the next few minutes, what I'd like you to do is in the chat, go ahead and share if there was one thing you already knew about that legislation, and if there was something that was new or refreshed for you. And I cannot see the chat in this setting.
Keep an eye on it.
Okay. All right. Anybody share anything interesting?
Nothing yet. There was a question about, will they get a copy of this presentation?
Oh, I think that Mary may be taking care of that.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure everyone gets a copy.
Okay, good. Okay, someone knew 15701. Great, Jennifer. Thank you. I found the chat. Yes, the bad day exemption is like it was a way to coin the phrase, make it a little, It's just one bad day. Sometimes we have that. Okay, well, keep sharing things that you have learned. We really appreciate the intervention. The interaction. Someone, Jennifer Baker, thanks for sharing that. This coming fall, every single school in the state will submit, but on odd fiscal years, it's just schools that have a letter grade of a C, D, or F. So the law does fluctuate. So there is that. All right. So great. I love that we've already shared some new information with all of you today. Be sure that you've bookmarked that because you'll want to revisit that, I'm sure, as you continue to learn from there. As we move on, it's important to note that all of these legislative pieces come together to create the Move On When Reading legislation. So all of those encompass all of the pieces of legislation. And it's important to note that it's K through third grade legislation, right? It's not just third grade legislation. And we know that a student who is struggling at third grade to read didn't just happen that way overnight. It is a K3 reading legislation. So it's important that we understand that the whole goal of all of this is to intervene early when we find and discover a reading struggle, no matter what it is, if we can identify it, and to intervene. Like, intervention is the key for all of this. So it is K3 legislation, so we can start the processes early in kindergarten so that we can change the trajectory. Third grade is essentially like the accountability grade, where now you're taking this test and we're going to keep track, that kind of thing. But reading development doesn't just happen in third grade. So I think that's really important to note, that it's really an intervention legislation, not something to penalize students for or teachers. Like, we really have to shift our focus, that our goal is to intervene early and often so that we can do the best we can for students and get them on the right track. We really want students to be lifelong readers, right? All right, so how does this all connect? How does this all relate? And I think it's really important for us to understand how the legislation that it's in place connects and relates to the science of reading. So we're going to do a couple of things just to make those direct connections to the science of reading and why things are called out the way they are. Okay. All right. So we're going to watch this little quick video from Stephanie Stoller. She's an expert in the science of reading, and she has some key nuggets. So sit back, watch her kind of share big ideas.
Hi, everyone. So, I've been creating different tools recently to help people introduce the science of reading to others. Last weekend, I was given a unique challenge to introduce the science of reading in under 3 minutes. So here are 6 things I'd like to share. Reading is not natural. No one is born to read. Reading isn't a natural skill like talking or walking. Reading doesn't happen by osmosis from being read to or from being in a literacy-rich environment. So if a student seems to be struggling, we can't just wait and see. And there is no such thing as giving a student the gift of time. If we wait, some kids don't get it. And if they don't have it by the end of first grade, they don't tend to catch it, even with intervention. This means that directly teaching reading skills rather than taking the child's lead will be more effective. Number 2, everyone learns to read in the same way. There aren't multiple ways to learn to read, so we don't need to match our approach to teaching reading to student preferences or learning styles. All skilled readers have phonics skills and age-appropriate language
Oh, I'm so sorry.
comprehension. Number 3, there is a known path to reading or circuit in the brains of skilled readers. The reading pathway relies on connecting speech sounds to print and to the meaning of words. Struggling readers and non-readers don't have these connections and actually might be using the wrong side of their brain when they read. Instruction can prevent or correct this, You can strengthen these pathways by basing reading instruction in language and reinforcing the speech-to-print connections, rather than relying on rote memorization, visual features of printed words, or guessing based on context or pictures. Number 4, some students acquire these circuits or pathways more easily. Others need lots of repetition and careful instruction to create these pathways, but it's the same pathway. Some students will require careful, deliberate, distributed, and cumulative practice. Some students have brains that make this kind of learning very difficult, but with the right kind of instruction, even students with dyslexia can learn to read. Number 5, all students benefit from explicit and systematic instruction in the skills that form this reading pathway. Students living in poverty, English learners, students with disabilities, and even the top students will learn from this kind of instruction and benefit from it. All students, even starting in kindergarten, benefit from explicit and systematic instruction. And finally, number 6, prevention is easier and cheaper than intervention. There are known indicators of reading that can be assessed at the beginning of kindergarten. Teaching these skills to students who don't have them when they enter kindergarten can change the course of their lives. Research can't answer all questions about reading, but there are things each of us are doing that aren't supported by research. There are things we can do today that won't cost anything, but could make a significant difference in whether or not our students learn to read. Let's learn together.
Okay. So what I heard her say, she spoke specifically about intervention, which was great. And, we're just the focus on what's most important and starting early, which is the whole focus of the Move On When Reading legislation. As we dig into more of what the experts have to say, we have what the science of reading is. We have 3 definitions here by different researchers in the field. I'll just give you a second to peruse that. And what we've done at ADE is that we've taken this insight and information from these experts, and we've created our statement that defines science of reading in Arizona. So you will see that here. It's that vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and the issues related to reading and writing. So it's not the science of reading isn't just a phonics only curriculum or anything like that. It's covering all of those basics, covering the reading elements, and along with that explicit and direct instruction, which was just mentioned in the video. Okay, so here is what science of reading looks like in the classroom. So the science of reading is the why we do things. It's the research. It's the foundational information. The evidence that we know works with students is the science of reading. And how is that manifested in the classroom? Through structured literacy approaches. And so you'll see here explicit instruction in the essential components. Again, essential or explicit instruction was in our legislation, if you recall. The essential components of reading are called out by legislation, which I believe we have a slide coming up too. It's the big 5 noted by the National Reading Panel report, plus 3 more. So oral language, spelling, and handwriting in Arizona's legislation. Oh, goodness gracious. Systematic, simple to complex, that's also called out. Things need to have a scope and sequence of skills. So it's not just a random, crazy hopping around from one topic to another. There's an order and a progression of skill development across the reading continuum. Again, same with cumulative. We're not just going to do one thing, leave it, and go back to just kind of hop around. That doesn't help those connections in the brain become foundation or connected and strong. So we need that cumulative review, that over time and practice. And then diagnostic. Again, this is referring to understanding where the skill gaps are and doing that fill in of those specific skill gaps in those essential components of reading, not necessarily diagnosing if somebody qualifies as meeting the dyslexia. Okay, so how does this look in a classroom? Now, this is a lot of information, but you'll see that over here we have the skill areas way to the left. Those are essentially the big five as identified by the National Reading Panel report in 2000. And so those are the big key areas. These are the elements of reading. We're going to see that here in just a second, but those elements. And then what does that look like in a structured literacy class? And then what does a typical class maybe look like that's not super focused on the structure of literacy? They may be doing their best and teaching what they know, but there is structured literacy is just that one step level better, more organized and succinct to make sure that we're meeting student needs. So I'll also give you a moment to read through those. I think the big thing to note in the structured literacy classroom is that it is structured. It is very specific, very targeted, very sequential, so that students get from beginning to end that reading continuum, the information they need across those key reading elements. Just focusing on one of those skill areas, those reading elements, won't get the job done. A student needs all of those. Every reader needs all of those to move on that continuum. And so it's important that we understand that, but then how do we move them and get them to where they're confident in each of these areas? As I mentioned, those key elements of reading are specifically called out in 704. You'll see here the essential components of reading is phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, reading fluency, reading comprehension, and then here you can see the oral language and spelling and handwriting. So it is the big five plus 3 more in Arizona that are required to be taught. Now you'll notice, well, and we didn't really tie it in, but our state standards, the standards that are required to be taught in class, also reflect this. So when you look at the K-3 standards, you'll be able to see that there are foundational reading standards included at every grade level, and actually they filter into 4th and 5th grade. But those foundational standards are what is to be taught in the classroom, and they mirror this as well. If you'd like to learn more about the science of reading or structured literacy, we have included a bunch of links in the webinar, and we'll be sure that you get these. I just want to go back to the slide really quickly. Oh, sorry. Okay. And so that's the big idea for us, is that we have legislation in place. Oh, this is what I was going to say. We have the legislation in place. That legislation has been in place for, gosh, more than 10 years now. It's been a hot minute that the MOWR legislation has been in place. The dyslexia components of the legislation were added in 2019, but for more than 10 years, Arizona has been a science of reading and a structured literacy state. We just have this renewed focus and connection with that. It's becoming more prevalent, and there's more and more research coming out to say how powerful and purposeful using the science of reading and structured literacy has become. So it's important that we ramp up what we're offering and how we're offering it. So so to wrap up what we've kind of said and making those connections between the legislation and the science of reading, solid structured literacy instruction for students to prevent reading struggles even before they get to 3rd grade. We have done both of those things today. So you'll see the MOWR legislation and then the law connected to the science of reading. What I'd like you to do is in the chat, if you can share one thing about the science of reading and or structured literacy that you are most excited about. Okay, well, if you think of something, throw it in the chat and we will review it there, or we'll have the time for questions and answers and follow up there. So that is actually the wrap for our session. We do have a little infographic. I'm not able to copy and paste it right now, but we'll get it in the chat for you so that you can see an infographic as well that kind of just talks about the science of reading and structured literacy if you'd like to share that with everyone. Yay, look at that. All right, and as you continue to post, we really appreciate you sharing in the chat and connecting with us. We have, here's my contact information and Maggie's. And then also I wanna be sure that you understand that we have, if you were on that MOWR page, you saw in that right-hand corner, there's a whole bunch of other sites that we have. We have, of course, our ELA standards page, and you were on the Move On When Reading page. But we have also recently added a whole science of reading page. So some of the clips or some of the links of things that we have included in this PowerPoint today are already available on the science of reading page that's connected to the MOWR page. And then Dyslexia, of course, has its own page, and then a secondary ELA for those of you who have teachers in the older space. So be sure to check those out. And we'll be sure to get you whatever information you need.
Thank you so much. We did have a few questions kind of throughout the chat. So I will go ahead and kind of go through those and see if you want to answer those. So we had one from Janet. She said, if a parent wants their child tested for a diagnosis, how do public schools respond?
So public schools are going to respond slightly different, I suppose. It's going to be, most often there's a child study team or a progress in place. Well, first off, we're going to go way even back before we get to that, right? Your students should be screened for early literacy skills at the beginning of every year. So that first initial screener, your school should know if there's more digging that needs to be done. And then they will have a diagnostic, which is that tool that a teacher can provide that will say, oh my goodness, we need some help with this key phonics element, or we need help with this thing. And it really pinpoints and targets where a gap may be. And then the intervention process starts. And that can be in the classroom, it can be a pull-out setting, it can be lots of different things based on the size of the school and the personnel that are available to help with that. So in that intervention process, hopefully those gaps are filled, and then we can move the student out of intervention and life will go on. If the need persists or it's not enough intervention, then we can adjust that intervention and increase it or change it however we need to. If over several iterations of intervention, we're not seeing that progress, then that's when we would move to whatever child study team or student study team or whatever it's called on like campus. So some districts call it different things, but essentially it's that next level of support to say, here's what we're noticing, here's the evidence we have from screeners and diagnostics and interventions and progress monitoring. You know, we're checking to see if we're doing okay. And then from that piece, then decisions would be made as to, whether additional testing is needed. Do we need to do a different type of intervention before we do testing? Those decisions can be made from that team. So the parent, teachers, whomever, administration can make that determination for what's best for that student. And so the parent would want to reach out to the school to find out what that process is and be a part of the team making those decisions.
Thank you so much. We had another kind of group of questions that kind of go together from Maria. So she was referring back to the Reading First initiative in schools, which was a previous movement. And then she said when the funding went away, some of the interventions and fidelity management also went away. So she was basically asking, is there funding attached to this new legislation?
So Reading First was federal legislation. And federal dollars attached. So there was a big influx and we have not seen those dollars since. So they went away and we haven't had them back. Now Move On When Reading is state funded, and it is funded in that schools receive approximately $150 per student in grades kinder through third. So if they have 50 first graders and 50 second graders, then they would get $150 for each of those 100 kids, kind of approximately, but that's the round numbers. And so that is how it's funded right now. With some new legislation coming on and the new appropriations, the budget, everything is still up in the air right now because the legislative session is still in progress. We may have some more funds coming, but it would mostly go toward teacher scholarships for the training for the dyslexia training designee and things like that. So no funding similar to what we had in Reading First back in the day. It was a great time, but at this point, we don't have that kind of funding, no.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a question from Jennifer. She said, who will be doing the diagnosis? How will this info be related to the appropriate school?
So again, that you would want to, I'm sorry, this was Jennifer?
This is Jennifer, yeah.
Okay. Jennifer, you would want to reach out to your school in particular to figure out who that might be. It's not going to be a teacher. It's if there's anybody trained on the campus who can do those more specific diagnosing of skills is going to potentially be the school psychologist, but it would depend on what kind of training they have. So definitely reach out to your school and see what they have for you.
Thank you. I saw another question, which I feel like maybe was already addressed about the screener, that is completed every year through third grade. Is that correct?
Correct. So the Universal Literacy and Dyslexia Screener happens in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade 3 times a year. So it would happen within the first 3 weeks typically of school, and then it happens usually December-ish. It depends on the school, of course, and when they start. And then again in late April, May-ish. And then all of those data is reported to us at the state level. Great. Not student, just like at Amy's awesome school in kindergarten, we had this many who were at benchmark and this many who were approaching and this many who were at risk.
Gotcha. Okay. There's again kind of a few questions lumped together about dyslexia being a medical diagnosis versus something a school psychologist can evaluate for, and then the whole kind of the difference between identifying it as a specific learning disability and maybe not specifically dyslexia. So do you have maybe some thoughts on that?
That's where we cross over from the land of general education and intervention into special education. And so we try hard to keep those, at least from our level, so that we don't cause stress and confusion. It would be best to reach out to the special education team to make those distinctions. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Thanks. Someone asked about, for the screener, is there going to be a parent notification that goes out with that, just so they know that process and that their child is taking that screener?
So every year by law, they should parents in grades K-3 should receive a letter about Move On When Reading. I know in the schools and districts I've been in, it typically goes home with the first day packet. So you're got bazillion letters and flyers and things, and so you might have missed it, but so it's a letter. It's kind of general speaking, and it may be on school or district letterhead, but it kind of shares what Move On When Reading is and what it means for K-3 students. And then a second letter goes home at any time a school or teacher has evidence that there's a concern. So it could just be that the student, dropped lower on a particular measure, and they just want to let the parents know. We had one of my schools once, we had students who were immigrants from another country, and they had a very heavy accent. So while we were doing the screener, it was hard for me to decipher what they were actually saying. And so we sent the letter home saying, "Ooh, we're worried." But then after we were able to dig a little deeper, it was me as the assessor not being able to hear through the heavy accent. And so those kinds of things can happen, but at least there was attention to it, and we could determine what the issue was, as opposed to saying, they're fine. We want to make sure that we're identifying those issues if they pop up.
A good example. Yeah. I think I've kind of brought up all the questions that kind of were happening. So if you guys have any additional questions, or if I missed any, if you want to go ahead and put those in the chat so they pop up now. And I'm sorry if I did miss your question. Let's Let's see. Janet is asking, can you clarify the funding when you were talking about the $150 per student? I think she's just asking for clarification on that.
So schools receive approximately $150 per student for MOWR funds. It's not released until they submit their literacy plan each year.
Okay.
And so they have to submit their literacy plan. And once it's reviewed, my team and I, we review them, make sure that all of the information is there, make sure that we understand it, make sure that they've documented things correctly. Then it goes to the State Board of Education for final approval. And then it goes to school finance, and so it's a process once it's
distribute
approved.
the funds. Yeah. Let's see. Maria was asking, is there a monitoring component with the concern letter or the 45 days?
We do not. We're a team of 2.5 right now, and that's all we'll ever be. So there is the real monitoring is we ask students, we ask schools to submit their letter as part of their literacy plan. So we have to see that. If you haven't received those, then definitely talk to your school.
Okay.
I did notice that somebody was asking for the video for Stephanie Stoller.
Yes.
I'm going to put the Science of Reading site in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
And on that page, if you go there, you'll see on this. Well, where'd she go? Well, I thought she was in Maggie. Is she in our Science of Reading page? I thought that's where we grabbed her from. Anyway, you'll have that, and then I will get the Stephanie Stoller link for you as well.
Sounds good. Thank you. It looks like there's a question about who can administer the dyslexia test. Is it going to be any teachers or just the dyslexia person at the school?
Okay, so to be clear, there is a universal literacy and dyslexia screener. The screener is a part of the tool that every student kinder through third gets. It's the dyslexia screeners are mostly tied to kinder and first, and that's any teacher who can be trained. It's same if you are using Dibbles or Acadience or FastBridge. Those are all tools that have already embedded the dyslexia screener, and I can put that link on there as well. And so and then the following the diagnostics usually are like a phonics screener or a phonemic awareness or phonological awareness screener. They're called screeners, but really they're diagnosing and digging in. And so a teacher could also give that one. Now, if you are doing something where you need to do a psychological test or those more advanced cognitive determining tests that are part of that special education process, like way down the line. So we're not talking about universal screening or diagnostics. We're past the intervention. We've gone through child study, and now we're determining if we want to test them for special education. That is not done by a teacher. A teacher does not diagnose dyslexia at all. That would need to be done by a specialist who has training in delivering those assessments. So we just have to be super careful that teachers are not diagnosing, that we are identifying reading struggles and intervening for the struggles. So we're talking skill specific. We're not talking about cognitive assessments or anything like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that clarification I think helps a lot. And this next question, I think this might be something you're going to be going over in maybe a future session, but you can let me know. And kind of looking at the funding from this newer dyslexia legislation, if there is funding and what that looks like.
So we are going to talk about upcoming. So currently there are some pieces in the legislation in motion that specifically in the governor's budget that would provide some additional funding, but we don't know exactly what that's going to look like and sound like until he signs the dotted line. So
hasn't been finalized. Yeah,
the law's passed and we need the budget finished. So I could throw wild numbers out and tomorrow it could change. So it's best to know we have to wait and be patient.
Right, makes sense. Let's see. I think there's another question. It says, in Acadience, which of the measures are the dyslexia screener, or is it all of the measures?
Okay, so I'm going to post in the chat the link to the Universal and Literacy Dyslexia Screener list. Control V.
Okay.
So these are the tools that have been approved for use. So embedded in the kinder and first grade tools, pieces of their tools, are the screener portions. Typically, it's RAN and nonsense word fluency, typically, but each vendor could do their own thing. It's important to note that I can't just go in and choose which piece I want to give. So the tools have been vetted and approved based on the overall composition of that product. Reliability and validity are incredibly important. And so if we start picking out little pieces, oh, I'm going to do nonsense word from this one and do RAN, rapid automized naming, from this one, and do this comprehension from over here. Well, now we have inherently destroyed any reliability and validity as a part of their overall scoring mechanism. So it's important that that if your district chooses Acadience or Illuminate or whatever, Amira, Fastbridge, whatever it is your school or district chooses, that you use the entire suite of things across the grade levels, so that you know that it's been vetted, it's valid, it's reliable, and it gives us consistent information. Does that make sense?
Super important. Yeah. Let's see. This next question, I don't know if I totally understand it, but it says the language of ARS, I want to say 15 to 11, says it ends July 2022. Is there a new law in the works?
So I'm not sure which part of it says it ends in 2022. What has happened is that there was some deadlines for getting things finished, like the Universal Literacy and Dyslexia Screener list had to be done by July 1 last year.
Okay.
The list of trainings for the dyslexia training designee has to be done by a certain date, but the current legislation is pushing those dates back. So while we had things ready with the dyslexia Universal Literacy and Dyslexia Screeners, we had it ready, it's been published, but with the current proposed changes in legislation, then it will give schools a whole nother year to make those selections.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for